Hey, how is everybody doing this fine evening? We are very fortunate tonight to have Dan Jurgens with us. As everybody knows, we tried to have Dan on a couple times this past summer, but the schedules just didn't work out. But tonight we have the good fortune of having Dan join us, and I'm looking forward to this. Now, Dan has worked on, as you know, a lot of DC, which of course DC is my second favorite publisher. But he did work on Thor, which is of course my favorite character, and so that's a plus. So I have some learning to do tonight, and I have some I don't have to learn a little bit about Thor because everybody knows he's my favorite. So here, let me bring Dan in and let's get started. Hey Dan, how are you doing this evening?
Quite well. How about you, Bill?
I am fantastic. I really mean that too. We've just lots of good things going on around here these days, and like we were talking about, the planning for the art show we're doing down here in Orlando. There's never a dull moment when you have as many rods in the fire as I've got right now. But how about you? How are you doing? I think you kind of had a little bit of a. How many shows did you go to this summer? I feel like I've seen your name on a couple shows.
Let's see. I did in the July. I had both Terrificon in Connecticut and San Diego, and then there were a few before that. And unfortunately, I actually had to cancel out on a couple of shows. Las Vegas in which I think was April, due to a death in the family, and that got in the way of things. So it hasn't been quite as loaded up with cons as I would have or as I had planned.
Oh, that's not too bad. Do you have any other, obviously, as everybody I hope knows, Dan is going to OAX at the end of January in 2024. But do you have any shows between now and OAX?
I do, but I don't have my list handy and I don't want to make a mistake. So I'll just I'll put that one to the side for right now.
All right, everybody, you can go and look at your favorite, show sites and see if Dan's listed there. But Dan, you were one of the people I talked to early about OAX, and and I figured we might as well just get that out of the way. I mean, I've always wanted to do an art centric show, and and more so since the pandemic when we were doing the virtual shows and really kind of getting back in this into that mindset of doing panels and finding ways to have people discover new artists and new art for sale and that sort of thing. But when I talked to you about it, you seemed genuinely happy to to hear about a show that focuses more attention back on the creators, and just explain to me why OAX was appealing to you as a comic creator.
Well, I think there are a number of reasons, Bill, and all of which we have discussed. And I think certainly one of the enticing things about it is it brings a bit of a European model into the United States, which I think is a really good thing. And also, as conventions have changed so much, and in many cases gotten bigger, sometimes it's harder to connect with the people that you want to connect with at the show. I think that's true for pros. I think it's true for fans. And there's that kind of a dynamic. And there's also this. And, over the past 10, 15 years, maybe even more now, the industry has become much, much more writer focused. And so I think this is a chance for us to get back to a model which does just focus on the artist. And there's a lot of reasons that the industry has taken that turn. But if that allows us to set something up that does bring kind of the artist back to prominence a little bit and focuses on what they do and that part of the medium, I think that's a real positive. And I think it's a positive in part because anybody who's going to be there is going to have that love for comic art, things like that. All of which I think kind of breeds that sense of enthusiasm. We all get juiced by it. But it's also just the awareness that the show exists for art like that. And I think it's a great thing.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. I mean, there's nothing wrong with a focus on writers. I mean, at all. I mean, you're a writer in your own way, obviously. It's just, I think that, like you said, and it's not just the entertainment side of some of the bigger shows and the focus there. There's definitely been a shift in thinking about the artist as being important, and part of that's the commerce side of things. Everything's got to be slabbed and signed, and it's just a different, it's not the shows that we went to in the late 80s and 90s and even early 2000s. They've just changed a lot, and the focus has changed a lot, and the fans have changed a lot too at those shows as well. It's just not the it's not your it's not the shows that I grew up on. And I think that I'm 55. There's a certain thing, kind of show format that I'd like to see, and try to take all the best parts for me, of a show today, put them into OAX is really what we were, what the goal was there. So that's the plan. And we've got a lot more work to do there, but I agree with you. I mean, the European model where artists are revered, right? I mean, they might as well be knighted regularly over there. And it's always funny how that never really has translated as well over in the States. And it's not like it has to go to that extreme, I think, but it is a visual medium. And so you wonder, why the artists haven't been able to keep that same kind of momentum as the writers have. And I don't know, it's probably part of the direction of the publishers too. I mean, the writers, they're creating the stories that that are out there, and you have to have focus on somebody at the end of the day,
right? Well, and I think some of it is because it's the idea of an artist really putting his stamp on a series is much, much harder now, because part of putting your stamp on a series or a character is being there for the duration. And by that, I mean, at least 3 years. And you're probably there doing, out of those 36 issues, at least 30 of them. And that just doesn't happen that much anymore. Publishers are much more likely to change out creative teams, especially the artists. The writer might stay that long, but you might have a 60-issue arc done by one artist and then another arc by somebody else. So that chance to stay on a character, to stay on a franchise, and really build yourself that way, it's much harder than it used to be, because the opportunities just aren't there. And that's very much the way I look at it, just in terms of Marvel and DC, not so much people who are doing their own thing. But I think that's a very real part of it.
You never really thought about that, but that's very true. You're right. Not too many creative teams stick with books very long. I mean, that's that might really be a big part of it, right? I mean, so the artists really don't get to establish themselves, with a character or a title for too long, and it's so, wow, that's very insightful. I never thought like that.
But I do think it's a reality. And then that's why, when a collection comes out, often it will have just the writer's name on the spine. And then the artists will object and say, well, shouldn't my name be there as well? And yes, it should. But at the same time, if there are 3 different pencilers across the, 10 issues that are in the collection or whatever, that makes that much less likely that it's going to happen. And I just think that then if you look at that across the industry with all the relaunches, or, one arc with one team on this book followed by a different arc, the idea of what we grew up reading, which was maybe an artist who was going to be on a series for, 5 years to something longer where they, do 100 issues or something like that. It's just not who we are anymore as an industry. It doesn't happen.
Right. Well, that's unfortunate. I mean, because as I grew up wanting to be a comic book illustrator, and so because you'd see John Byrne on a run for 36 issues, whether it was Uncanny or FF or whatever, Sal Buscema on Hulk, for so long, Kurt Swan on Superman or Action Comics. I mean, those are the things that you were so used to. And I haven't even mentioned Jack Kirby, right, at the end of the day, or Carmen Infantino, guys like that who really spent large amounts of time on different books. So gosh, I never really thought about it like that, and now I'm disappointed that we don't have that type of an industry any longer. But yeah, I guess that might spell why we're here today.
Yeah.
So you as a writer, though, I mean, you clearly, you see that happening, and there's really probably, I mean, do you see any way that we can ever get back to a point in time where creators stay on titles for more than 3 to 6 issues? I mean, where you can do a 1 year or 2 year, 3 year arc?
It would be nice, and I think there will be opportunities for some people to do that.
Mhm.
At the same time, when it happens, it's going to be the exception to the rule, because now what happens so much is um, a book will get relaunched somewhere or something like that. So you take the ever popular Popsicle Man series and it runs 12 issues, and then they stop and bring it back 6 months later, and it's the adventures of Popsicle Man with an all new creative team. And that's kind of the cycle that we are stuck in right now. And they will look at it more and more and just say, when I say they, I mean the publishers, and say, well, the only way we can, ignite the market to come pick up our new first issue is with a different creative team. So that
Mhm.
really is that where we are stuck right now. That is what the business is, and I don't see that changing. If anything, it seems to be accelerating.
That's unfortunate, but yeah, I would agree with you on that. So, so now that we've established all that, we should start talking about the good old days of comic book creation. I mean, when you guys would have a Superman summit over at DC and try to plot out the next, 6 months, 12 months, and try to figure those things out. I mean, clearly those things don't don't happen today. So, what were those, and I'm talking, this is, so that's early 90s for that, but, and you've been professional since the early 80s. I mean, what were those kind of, editorial sit downs with creative teams like when you were working with a character who spanned multiple titles like Superman, and you kind of had to find a cohesive way to make them all, everything work together and gel? It just seems almost, did you have to have a strong editorial presence in the room to make that work, or were the writers able
Oh,
to,
yeah,
no?
absolutely. Well, absolutely. And I would also add, however, that those kinds of things, those editorial sessions, do still exist,
Mhm.
where writers will come in, and whether it's for a particular franchise or a particular crossover effort or something like that. Again, not as often as it used to, but that does still happen. But in the case of Superman, yeah, we had Mike Carlin, who was very much a very strong editor and a strong presence in the room. And one of the things that Mike was so good at was hiring a group of creators, both in terms of writers and artists, who I think saw Superman the same way he did. So once you walk into that room, if you're sitting in the conference room in the office or at a conference room in a hotel, wherever it might be, um, it really helps to be able to advance the ball if everybody, sees the character the same way. If
Mhm.
you think of any particular character with that sense of shared sensibility, and you can kind of agree on, Superman would do this, he would not do that. Once you understand that character and have that common understanding, and then take that as your bedrock, the foundation of where you're going to build story from, you're way ahead of the game. And it doesn't, it seems like that would be the case in any writer's room, but it certainly isn't always the case, where sometimes it will be a basic and very fundamental disagreement among creators about who the character is or how he or she might react in a particular situation. And if you don't necessarily agree on that, or come to some common understanding, then it's very difficult to build story.
Mhm. And so Mike was a good leader as far
Oh
as being
yeah,
able to kind of corral everybody's
he
ideas,
was. Yeah,
focus everyone.
Mike was great, and he was very committed to his creators when you were working for him. He did a good job of running interference for us with the office, which happens on. It's needed on anything, right? Because it's a creative enterprise, and things just don't always go swimmingly. Um, but more than anything, as I said, Mike was good about bringing in people who had a common sensibility. So from there, when I first showed up, we only had the 2 Superman books a month, Superman and Adventures, and then Action got worked into it. So there were 3 books, which then became 4 when we worked in Man of Steel. And in doing that, we were able to kind of naturally build this idea of how we would almost treat it like a weekly comic. And in terms of, common threads among the supporting cast that would continue from book to book, and to work it out in terms of that amount of detail. So yeah, the Adventure of Superman might continue across the titles, but so did, whatever was happening with Perry White and his wife, or his son, or Cat Grant and her family, things like that, because we were all also pretty much committed to the idea that, yeah, as much as we all like to see Superman punching out the bad guy, you kind of need that soap opera element of a supporting cast to keep people coming back.
That is very true. Well, that's great. Then, did you always want to be, because you've done so much writing and drawing? I mean, when you were coming into the industry, did you feel that you were going to be, could you have predicted at that point that you would have done, as much writing and drawing as you have? I mean, not many creators come in with that kind of approach to their professional career. I would think that they're, one's going to be focused more on writing versus drawing, and somebody knows they're better talented at, just being a letterer or an inker. But for you, I mean, you started in your early 20s in the business. And I mean, where did you see yourself at that point in your, just getting started out?
It's weird because I kind of had sort of like 2 different ways of looking at it. And on the one hand, I kind of looked at it and said, I'll do this, I'll get it out of my system, and then I'll go back to like the advertising design world where I had come from, go back and get a real job, that kind of thing. But at the same time, from the start, when I did start with DC, I did make it known pretty much from day one that I had an interest in writing as well, and that I would want to get to the point, if they would let me, where I would both write and draw my own stories. I don't know if I go back to that time that I ever would have seen that I would get to the point sometimes where I would be like writing 4 books a month and just doing covers or something like that. And I don't want to be back at that again. That kind of happened by accident, because I do want to draw more than that. But it's one of those things that worked out very well. And it actually started because I had co-created a series for DC called Sun Devils that Jerry Conway was writer and editor on. And it was created by Jerry, Roy Thomas, and me. And, Jerry was overloaded on work. And so he would kind of call me up and we would just talk about the plot. I would take notes. Jerry might send me some more notes, and we would kind of build the story issue by issue very organically that way. So that then when Jerry got overloaded with work and he needed someone to write the last 5 issues, I believe, he said, why don't you just do it? I'm the editor. The characters. I would always write dialogue notes in the panel borders and things like that. And, so that's really how I got my start, and I just went from there.
Wow, that's great though. It's back to trust, right? At the end of the day, and talent. I mean, I think I read somewhere that Mike Grell kind of helped you kind of get, maybe not a foot in the door, but let people know that he thought you were a talented illustrator, and you got. Is that true, or was I misreading an article about you?
No, that's very true. Mike was appearing at a comic store on a personal appearance in my community, and I stopped on the way home from work one night and showed him my portfolio. And at that time, he had been writing and drawing a character he created called Warlord, for those who remember that great series. And Mike had stopped drawing it. He was going to be going off to First Comics to do Sable. And they were looking for a different artist on Warlord. Someone else had stepped in already. I don't think they were necessarily really thrilled with it. So I showed Mike my stuff, and he said, look, I want you to send this to Lori Sutton, who was the editor on the book at the time. We'll get it to her right away. and see what she thinks, because I'd love to have you come in and give it a try. And so I sent my work to Lori Sutton, who was at DC at that time, editing Warlord. I'm sure there were a couple of conversations between she and Mike on the background. And they said, yeah, we'll give you a shot. And so I did the first issue. And, by the time I had sent in the pages, because I think the understanding was, we'll give you a shot and then we'll see. But by the time I was done with that first issue, or halfway through the second one, they said the book is yours. Have fun.
That's amazing, right? I mean,
Yeah.
how well, I mean, it doesn't seem to always work that way, where you get the chance and they love it immediately. But so back in the day, were you sending your pencils only into to DC, and then seeing the work get inked by another creator? And then, I mean, what was that kind of an experience like as a new penciler, having other people finish your work?
That is such that was and can still be, but not nearly to the same degree. But at the time, that was a very strange experience. Because I sent in the boards. Mike DiCarlo inked my first issue, and I really liked what he did. It came out, had a very nice feel. But then I think it was either the second or third one I did, where Mike was unavailable, and they got Wayne Howard to ink it, which was a very, very different style then. And I did not care for the way that one turned out. And part of it is, at least for me, and I think a lot of pencilers do this though, but once you start working with an inker and you start to kind of figure out what their strong points are, I try and tailor my approach to what the inker does well in some cases, in most cases. And so all of a sudden, if you draw it expecting it'll be one person and it's something else with a very different style, that can look very abrupt on the page. And I don't know the readers notices, but I sure as hell do. And I did at time. So yeah, that's something that does take a while to adjust to, is this idea of, sending off the boards and working with different people. Fortunately though, I've had this, wonderful career where I've been able to work with so many different inkers, all of whom are incredibly talented for the most part. So, I mean, I've worked with some great, great people, all of whom, take the pencils and make them look better. And that's, hey, I'm all for that.
Yeah. Exactly. Right. So, I mean, when you're writing a book, do you feel like, you want to have say in who the penciler is and who the inker is and who the letterer is? I mean, do you feel, because I feel like, I've read a lot about Chris Claremont having the idea of, liking it, had to have a lot of control over who his artists were, say, in the 80s and 90s, to the extent that, he used Orzechowski as his letterer for years and years and years, so that there was this continuity that, kind of flowed through his work, which is funny, as a comic reader, you don't really, I mean, I didn't realize that, but I thought that that's, that there's a level of care that kind of goes into, a writer's approach to the story they're trying to tell. I mean, do you approach things in a similar way?
100%.
Yeah.
And I get as much as I can. I will try and describe, if I'm only going to be writing a book and not drawing it, I will try and describe, a visual sense that I want a book to have. And quite often, Editorial might send me a list of names that they want to use, and I'll say, no, because none of them match up with that sensibility that I'm talking about here. So here are some names of people who do. And even if they can't do it, if they aren't available or don't want to, think along these lines, because this is what we want it to feel like at the end of the day. And it doesn't always work. Every now and then I'll end up writing something and an artist will have to pull out at the last minute and someone else will have to step in, which can be very frustrating. But yeah, all the way through, whether it's the penciler, inker, letterer, colorist, whomever, I get very involved in who those people are going to be.
That's great. I mean, I think that those are the things that we as comic readers and fans don't know is really going on behind the scenes. But they're incredibly important for the, it's because it's a visual medium, but there needs to be someone in charge trying to craft that vision, from beginning to end. And and I think that's something that I honestly never considered too much of. I mean, I always felt like, I love the visual side of comics. I feel like in some cases maybe I didn't always need to read the story completely to understand it if I could look at all the artwork. And but it's great to know that writers, at least had that level of care and concern to make sure that you had the right team surrounding you to tell the story the way you wanted to, and visually, the impact you wanted to have on the reader too.
Yeah, and it's the other part of it is this, and that is that a lot of writers, so if we step back again, if we go back to say 80s, early 80s when I started working, most books were probably produced under what we now refer to as the Marvel method. So it's, plot first rather than full script. Now most comics are produced full script style. As an artist, I always preferred plot. As a writer, I always feel that if we go with that Marvel approach of, plot first, I get a better art job. The artist gets more involved. They get a chance to be more expressive. I find they then get more interested in the characters. They get more interested in the beats of the story as it goes along. So almost anything I write, I prefer to work Marvel method, but that is based on, in many cases, me getting the people on board that I want to draw the book, because then I know I can trust them with that. And I know what they're going to bring to it in order to do that. Because this goes back to what we were talking about earlier. It is a visual medium. And what I want to do is, if I'm working with another artist, is have them really engaged in the story and the characters so that they don't feel like they're just a wrist. I want them to make contributions to the story. I pretty much think an artist is going to be able to do any dramatic or action sequence better than a writer is necessarily going to write it as a full script. So part of me getting that crew I want to work on a book and work with is because I do want them then to be able to run more, and I trust them to do that.
Wow, that's great. It says, let's see. Oh, sorry, I was reading in the comments there. But so, case in point, what was it like working with John Romita Jr. on the Thor comics? I mean, was that plot only, or how did you work with him during that run?
No, that we did that Marvel style, and I would, I had been asked actually to do Thor like a couple of years earlier, and I just said no, I don't have anything for it at this time. I'm just not feeling it right. But then with the Heroes Return stuff that Marvel was doing at that time, the timing was better. They had John on the book, and I knew that that John was really going to be able to do this. And part of it is because I had seen his Thorian book that he did as part of the Amalgam crossover in the DC versus Marvel stuff. So I knew that John was absolutely going to be able to knock it out of the park. And again, make me look good as a writer. So with he is such a consummate storyteller that it's almost like the more I pared it down a little bit and left up to him, the bigger the visuals got. And it probably took us just an issue and a half. Sometimes it takes like 4 or 5 issues to really build that creative relationship. But John and I think we got to it really right away, issue and a half. And we're off and running. I mean, he was just fantastic. And to this day, I still tell him, of all the stuff he's ever done, I still think Thor is the best. So I think he was perfect for it. He really was.
I completely agree. I mean, I love that run. Now, did Editorial pair you, or did they approach you? When you were ready to do the story, did you immediately, did you lean on them to say, John was whom you wanted to work with on that book?
Actually, when they first called me up, they said, asked if I were interested. I said, yeah. And they said, we would like you to do it with John Romita Jr. if you would like to work with him. And I said, yes and yes. So they certainly had John in mind. And I saw that as just him being such a perfect fit for it, that it was like a total brainer. End of discussion. Let's go. Let's get started.
Had you worked with him before?
No, I had not. No. That was our first collaboration.
Interesting. I mean, to be so sure, and you were, and it turned out. I mean, you were very right. I mean, and they were right to pair you guys together, because again, the art was fantastic. Because initially, I'm thinking, oh, it's not going to translate well in Thor, and yet he did a phenomenal job with the visuals. I mean, much better than I was expecting.
It's as I always look back at it, and this is sort of what we said at the time. I mean, he was definitely channeling that sort of Kirby vibe and sense of atmosphere, while also being very much who he is as an artist. And that to me is ideal when someone can get to that point. In a way, it's what we all shoot for, which is, what was the most successful visual aspect of a character, say over an 80-year history? How can I kind of pull that out and then add your own sense of style and flavor to it to elevate it? And John did that in spades. And I think that John very much was our Jack Kirby. And then after him, when Andy Kubert stepped in, Andy sort of became John Buscema, because his figures were a little more pliable. The faces were different and everything, but I thought it was a very natural segue, in fact, to go from John to Andy, and just it worked out great. It was a fun time.
No, I completely agree. I mean, because for me, Thor, has had high points in his career, with creative teams and storylines, and then kind of mediocre ones. And as again, being my favorite character, it's always I always want to see those high points. And your run was definitely one where that was we had that kind of in spades. I felt like, I mean, when with whether it's Thor or Superman, I mean, I would imagine, well, maybe I'm not. When you approach characters that have such long histories as those two that I just mentioned, I mean, do you feel kind of pressured going into working with a character that you've never written before, or do you, or is there a level of confidence that just kind of moves you through the creative process, where you just know you're going to be able to tell your best story for this character, and you're not too worried about relying on the historical teams that have worked on a book or a character over time?
Every project is different, and it's never the same answer, if that makes sense. So, like when I started on Superman, I was drawing it first, and we were at the stage where George Perez was going to be writing what I was drawing, and so George plotted the first few issues, and then he had to step aside. And when Carlin called me up and said, "Do you want to write it?" It's weird, because as an artist, had total confidence. Yeah, I can draw this. I can work with George. I'll make it look good. No problem. Then when they introduced the idea of writing Superman, that makes you think a little bit, and part of it is because you're much more on an island, so if the book fails, it's like, well, it's pretty damn clear who screwed up. When you're writing it and drawing it, you don't have anyone to blame. So on that one, I thought twice. With Thor, it was, I had been in the office very early in the process of planning Thor, and Bob Harris, who was, editor-in-chief at the time, kind of said, I just don't know if there's a audience for Thor anymore. He said he's got long hair, and there's all this talk about the gods in the comics. And he said, when Stan and Jack, first did that was very unique and very rare. And he said, this is like when Fabio was big, and he said, now everybody in comics has long hair. I just don't know if there's an audience for Thor. And in a way, that's like the challenge, and I think I really got into the idea of taking it on as a challenge and say, okay, by God, let's find out if there is an audience. Let's make them read the book. And that true is where, John and Klaus Janson, who was inking John, were so essential to delivering that sense of boldness. And because John draws these very, very bold figures, and then Klaus has this very bold ink line that just enhances all of that on the page. And
It really does.
yeah, we managed to find an audience. We made Thor relevant again.
Well, that's great. Again, not something I'd ever think about. It's like, you go in thinking about how to sway the reader's mindset on a character, and that it's not like you have a chip on your shoulder, but you want it to be revelatory to the audience, and hopefully help that character and that title get discovered by people who maybe were overlooking it for so long. Like I said, I feel like he's had a lot of mediocre times and high points throughout his career, on solo titles, that's for sure, such that I think that's cool that you approach it as a challenge, not just to tell great stories, but to convince the audience that that the character can be relevant and even more important than they ever would have imagined.
Yeah. And, some of it too is whenever you're working in the industry, like at that time where, like the X-Men was king of the hill sales wise and everything, right? You just say, okay, we're not going to beat that. No one is. But at the same time, you want it to work very, very well for a whole lot of reasons. And so with Thor, to make it work as well as it did, and again, to be able to work with a couple of great guys like John and Andy, and then after that, Stuart Immonen, and it was really, really a special time. Like I said, it was a lot of fun.
That's great. Now you mentioned George Perez earlier, and you and he worked on that Teen Titans book for 2 years. I mean, George is probably one of the nicest people I've ever had the pleasure of meeting. I think one of the greatest talents we might ever see in comics, as far as being an illustrator and his passion for the medium. I mean, what was it like working with George, not just on that 2-year run with the Teen Titans book, but clearly you worked with him on other projects as well.
Yeah, it's the funny thing is, because a few years ago, George and I were just talking about the times that we worked together, and what was really weird about it is most people think of, they'll say me, if I say I had worked on something with George, they might see me as being a writer that George drew something, and George never really drew anything I wrote. He did, however, inked me on Titans for a couple of years, and then I drew several things that he had written over time. So, it's funny, you can kind of get into someone's head a little bit that way. And yes, he is one of the absolute nicest guys around that there ever was in this business. We all miss him very much to this day. But, any collaboration with George was always so much fun. And whether it was Titans or even during the New 52 stuff when he was inking me on Green Arrow, things like that. George's commitment to whatever he did was just incredible and so thorough, so that, even when he had written a couple of issues of Superman that I was drawing, calling me up just to say, even though he would have turned in the plot like a month and a half earlier, and he'd call me up and say, yeah, I was thinking about page 10 and maybe we should change that. You haven't drawn it yet, have you? And that kind of thing. And because he would keep working on it in his head and want to make just a couple of small twists and changes. And that, I think, was just part of who he was, because he was always so engaged with what he was doing.
Oh, that's wonderful. I never got to talk to him, as kind of as a creative. I mean, got to see him at several shows and whatnot, but never really, and I never really asked anybody about it that's worked with him. So, I admire him greatly. But it's nice to hear that. I mean, it's something that, I think we as fans of, especially on the art side, we really appreciate the craft that goes into visual storytelling, and knowing that there's a twist or turn that he thinks he can improve on after he's handed over a script, is cool to know. I mean, it's something that, makes us love his artwork and his person even more, to know that he was that much of a perfectionist, because you already thought you look at his work, whether he's penciling or he's inking, he clearly, his attention to detail and his desire to, to fill a page with as many, small details as possible. I mean, nobody could draw rocks and planets quite like him, right? I mean,
Oh,
he
yeah.
just, but then say he wouldn't, nobody could draw a crowd scene or a city scene quite the same way that George did, with as much attention to detail and have it not look over rendered.
Right.
It's so difficult to do that, and he just made it look so effortlessly. And
Yeah.
I've always appreciated that. I mean, he made me read the his run with Teen Titans and Wolfman, because and I don't think I'd picked up a DC book until that, and it was just because his work was so phenomenal, and it seemed
Yes.
like he always gave it his all. And I mean, just a remarkable man.
Yeah, he really was. And one of the things I've been very fortunate in is that since I both write and draw, it has allowed me to work with people in a lot of different capacities that I would not necessarily otherwise work with. So, I've gotten to work with some truly great writers, those who were in the business long before I was, and I'm, proud to have been able to do that. I've been able to write for, whether it was John Buscema or Gil Kane or so many others, that I got to work with them that way, or to have, I mentioned Klaus Janson earlier, or so many other great anchors ink my stuff or draw my stuff or draw for somebody else. One of the best parts about being a writer artist has been that ability to work, kind of across the disciplines with so many great talented people. It's been a lot of fun.
I didn't, maybe I didn't do a lot of research, but no idea. So you got to work with Buscema. I mean,
He only once,
my favorites.
I think only once. Yeah. He did an issue of Thor for us as a fill-in, and just to be able to say, okay, I'm going to write for John Buscema. I mean, that's special. It's fantastic. Or, to say I'm going to write for Gil Kane, or something like that, or Kurt Swan. You can go down that list, and it's really wonderful to be able to do that.
Well, I mean, I think the list of creators you've gotten to work with is pretty long. I mean, is there anybody they ever worked with that you felt, that there's going to be a challenge? I mean, just because of whom they were, not from a work perspective, but just that you had to live up to a standard that that creator you felt demanded. I mean, was there ever anything like that as a doubt for you when you approach a project, or is it you don't tackle a project that you're not very confident about?
Well, yeah, there have been things like that. Well, for example, and I've told this story before, and so some may have heard it, but there was a time we were talking about Teen Titans and Marv and George, and there was a time when DC was doing what they called the hardcover softcover approach to both Titans and Legion of Superheroes. So they would do an issue of Titans on Baxter paper. They had to, would then print it like a year later on for the normal newsstand. I mean, this is when everyone was trying to figure out the direct market stuff. And they had just launched Titans as a Baxter book. And I think maybe they started late or whatever, but by issue 5 or 6, I think issue 6, they needed a fill-in. And so, they called me up and asked me to draw it. And so it was a plot written by Marv. And there was a double page spread very early in the story, probably pages 2 and 3, that was a ticker tape parade taking place in New York City, and written right into it. Marv actually wrote this, and I've given him a hard time for it. He wrote in there, ticker tape parade in New York City, and here's everything that's going on, and blah, 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 blah. And he has the description of the scene. And then at the end of it, he writes, with so much detail, it would make George Perez jealous. I mean, come on. On my best day, I was never going to be able to do enough detail that would make George Perez jealous. So you get something like that, and it's like, come on, man. I mean, and so, yeah, over time, I remember I did a story with Stan Lee for Byron Price Publications. And there is something about getting a script on your desk that says written by Stan Lee, where you kind of go, am I really doing this? So I better not screw this one up, that kind of thing. So yes, it happens.
Well, that's good to know. I mean, I would have to think for me, because if it was me, I'd probably be nervous and have too much anxiety all the time. But that's cool. I mean, but it does kind of fall back on sometimes it's the stature of the other person, or maybe it's like in Marv's case, writing that. I mean, so you knew going into like a lot of the page design and layout from Marv. I mean, what he was expecting. I mean, would he as a writer typically tell you this is going to be a DPS, or I want it to be a DPS? I mean,
yeah.
So,
and I do that too, because typically you're building to that as such a major point that you are going to call that out, and that's where even working Marvel style in terms of how the panels are broken down leading up to that and coming out of it, the artist can take the essence of the story and kind of pace it the way they feel is best to get us there. But by God, once you get there, this is what it has to be. A plot to me is sort of like the roadmap, right? We're all going to go to Pittsburgh. We know we're going to get to Pittsburgh. We can deviate off the main road here and there, and you can decide where we're going to stop for lunch, but we still got to get to Pittsburgh. So, you give an artist that sense of freedom and allow them to build that in the way that is comfortable for the way they tell a story. But you still got to get to Pittsburgh.
Right. Exactly. Hey, we've had a few questions come in throughout this. So I thought maybe we could switch over and hit a few of these. Rob T wanted to know, did Dan give any thought to penciling Blue and Gold himself, the one that came out over the past year?
Yeah, I did, and we talked about that as a possibility. But then when Ryan Sook became available, I love his stuff so much, and Ryan is a friend whose work I have tremendous respect for, and I thought, this is where we talk about what is the visual sense that we want the book to have, and how do we want it to play out. And Ryan was perfect for it. So at that point, in a way, I would like to draw it. At the same time, that's not always possible by any means, given my schedule. So I was very, very happy to have Ryan come on, and delighted with what he did.
Yeah, I love Ryan's work as well. I mean,
oh yeah. And we had worked together previously on a couple of different things. When we were doing the Future's End weekly series, Ryan was our cover artist on that. And as we had our editorial meetings, where we as writers got together and talked about what the story was going to be, Ryan was in those meetings doing character sketches and designs right on the spot. Or he'd say, hey, you know what might work well here is if it's this and everything. And I think it was a great collaboration, and a lot of fun. It was, as writers, it was me, Brian Azzarello, Keith Giffen, and Jeff Lemire. And so with Ryan in the room, kind of coming up with a lot of the visuals, especially since three of us are artists as well.
Exactly.
It made for a fun story planning session. It really did.
That does sound like it would be an enjoyable, thing to go through. And speaking of like doing drawings while you're, in the creative room and coming up with concepts and stuff. I mean, I read that you came up with the design for Doomsday while you were in one of those summit meetings, right? Yeah. I mean, have you kept that?
Yes. Yeah. I still have the original, which is
good for you.
the initial sketch. The initial sketch was done on a yellow legal pad, and I still have the sheet and still have the notes and things like that. And then, so what we did is, so just detouring off the main topic a little bit. Yeah, we started talking about it. I described the monster and what it would be. We didn't even have the name at that point, I don't think. And then a couple of us did sketches while we sat there, and we then voted and went with mine and went from there. I came back and then did the initial, much more finished characters designs based on the sketch that I did in the meeting. Yes.
Well, I'm glad you held on to it. That's
yeah.
That's one of those things that you always wonder what happens to those things. Do they get thrown out? Do they, give them to your favorite comic creator who might, like give it to Mike Carlin, right, or something,
Yeah, yeah.
as a gift. No, that's wonderful, absolutely wonderful, because it's, I think those works of inspiration don't exist by and large probably out there. You can always get like John Romita Sr., who's you can see his first drawing of Wolverine or something. At least you believe it's the first drawing of Wolverine.
Right.
You guys were actually in a planning session with legal pads in front of you, coming up with those sorts of things. I just love that. I think many art collectors, we love the process of comics. I mean,
Oh,
even
yeah.
to this day, and while we sometimes lament the fact that there's like inks are done on blue lines, but one of the cool things that's come out of all that is that something you still get to, if you're lucky, you can own both the pencil page and the ink page. And I love when I can get that, because I love seeing the pencil page by itself, untouched by any inks. It's just different. It's not something that we would have gotten 20 years ago. And as a process person, that's just exciting, and again, it's not like a character design sheet that you put out there so it was for other artists. This was like all inspiration.
Yes, quite true, quite true.
Let's see here. Where was the other one? Dan, when writing for another artist, do you ever sketch out what you have in mind for a particular? Yeah, so I mean, similar kind of to the DPS question. I mean, do you give artists kind of thumbnail? I mean, I think Alan Moore was famously, that was kind of his direction with some artists that he worked with, where he would kind of give, with his script, maybe plot out a little bit. Do you tend to do that or avoid
it? It depends on the situation. I have done it several times, and it depends in some cases. Sometimes it's just plain easier for me to thumbnail it out rather than write it all down. Right. Mm-hmm. There are other times when somehow the artist just isn't getting to where we want the story to be or the action to be. And I'll go back in and sketch it out and send it to them and say, this is more of what we are thinking. When I do that, I never ever do that unless it's discussed with editorial first to make sure that they agree and are on board. Other times it's with someone who maybe isn't comfortable working on a plot. They're only used to working full script. So I can help them a little bit just by saying, think of it this way, mm-hmm. and I go back to a Superman. One of the first Superman jobs I did was a Superman annual that was written by Jim Starlin. And Starlin had a very unique way of communicating what he wanted in the script, because the script was fairly minimal in terms of scene descriptions and detail and things like that. But on each page, so this is pre-computer, because he actually would draw it on the script pages, he would just do the panel layout. And so he wouldn't draw anything inside the panels. It was just the panel layout. So if a writer does that, and let's say they just say 4 panels, an artist might approach that and do it kind of the Kirby grid 1, 2, 3, 4, mm-hmm. Or stack them 4 horizontal panels, or just make them all different sizes. But if all of a sudden it's Jim and he's going with 3 slender vertical panels on top and 1 horizontal on the bottom, you're seeing the action the way he sees it as a writer, if that makes any sense. So it's mm-hmm. like if he says close up on Superman's eye, and yet it's a long vertical panel, you know exactly how that's going to look. Or if it's in the horizontal panel underneath, you're zooming in very, very tightly then on Superman's eyes. And I found it to be an incredibly compelling way to put together a script and just do the panel arrangement, because mm-hmm. the panel arrangement will then suggest the pace and how it's going to break down and what's going to be in each panel. And if we think of Jim's stuff, which can be fairly individualistic as to how he tells a story, it's interesting. I found myself telling a story like Jim would if he would draw it, I think, which is why he wrote it that way in the first place. It was very insightful without him ever drawing like so much as a stick figure.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
You would never think but he really he was putting a lot of faith in you seeing his panel layout and interpreting it the way he wanted. I mean, that's amazing. I mean, I would never have thought of that a creative process like that would have existed. I would think either they have to put the stick figures in too, or they're not even going to give you a layout. That's
and there have been other guys who will just, for a script, you get basically the story thumbed out with stick figures.
Mm-hmm.
And I found that once tremendously frustrating. The writer will go unnamed, but I did like 6 pages and sent them in. The editor called me up and said, yeah, I gave the pages to the writer, and he's all pissed off because it's supposed to be taking place at night and you've got it taking place during broad daylight. And I said, look, you give me nothing but stick figures. There's not one word in anything there that suggests it's at night. There's no moon in the sky. There's nothing that suggests this is taking place at night. So cut me some slack here.
You might have missed that crescent moon.
Yeah, exactly. Just do something. Yeah. Sometimes the written word actually has some benefit to it.
Right. That's wow. That's interesting, though. I mean, you could probably tell us, 20 different ways in which, scripts are, handed in by, different creators. But I would never have guessed that. But that's cool. Starlin, obviously, he's been around a very long time, and he's taken many a script from creators too. So, to have him, as somebody who's a very gifted illustrator, approach his writing in a manner that is really only about trying to, because panels set up pace, in a lot of ways.
Right.
And so he's really trying to help you understand how he wants his script paced. And I think that's really interesting. Again, that's why we love looking at the, the final finished product. It's because it's so, there's so much there. There's a lot of pretty pictures on it, but, understanding, how somebody is approaching, overall layout like that is just, and story is just, it's wonderful. I'm so glad you're telling me these stories, Dan.
There are a lot of ways, a lot of very different ways of working in comics and creating comics. Yes.
Kind of back to when I mentioned the Doomsday earlier. Carl wanted to know, did the backstory for Doomsday and his link to Krypton develop during writing Hunter Prey or earlier during the Death story?
So on that one, when I was working on the Death of Superman, the issue in question, 75, and was getting to the point where that was getting done, we had never really talked too much about what Doomsday's origin would be. As we planned the Death of Superman story, we said, okay, how did he get in that vault underground? And we all threw out some different ideas and things like that. But we said, you know what? Let's play it like a mystery. We don't have to answer everything now. We really wanted to do that story where we would hit the ground running, get into the action very, very fast, and just, go. That's really what we wanted that to be. And so we didn't spend a lot of time talking about the origin, so that later, as I was working on the Death of, then I really started to think about it more in depth. And then I think it was Superman 78 where we come back after not having been published for a while, and I have Cyborg Superman kind of chain up Doomsday to an asteroid and throw him into space. That then is when I really started to focus on it, so that when I went to DC and we started talking about Hunter Prey, I put it all together then. So really the whole origin, as a creator, you think about this stuff while you're working on it. You get some ideas, you throw a lot of them away because they just are wretched. But then it really came together as I put together Superman Hunter Prey.
Well, that makes sense. I mean, it had to have kind of eaten at you a bit, right? I mean, something that's got to percolate for a while, that that there's probably going to be a need for this backstory and origin at some point. And unfortunately, you get to be the one to kind of pull it all together too. That's great.
Yeah. And we did talk about this. We said maybe we should never tell it. Maybe we should just, at that point we'd say it's not like we know Wolverine's origin story. I mean, maybe we should never ever go there. And then I think we also, I certainly realized if I don't do it, someone else will.
Mhm.
It might be 10 years from now, and it'll be someone else, and I'll hate it. So, okay, I'll spend some time on this one and come up with something.
Right. No, well, it's fitting, right? I mean, especially since you did that first, the first drawing on the legal pad. I mean, it
Right, right.
kind of get to come full circle. It was your right to refuse to do the origin story, I think. So, good that you did. Let's see, just a comment from Super Russ 9000 said, just have to say that when I was 13, the very first comic I picked up was Action Comics 688. And where was the other one I was looking for? There was let's see. And this is something I wanted to thank you for that. Kevin Sharp had you do that page I love, and you did the
Oh, yeah.
you did the I can't remember the cover. I know it was Infantino. That was an amazing piece of work, and it was one. And not being a DC guy, I miss out on a lot of some of the artwork that that is really truly impressive. And that was that cover was striking for so many
Yes.
different ways.
And when you go back to that time, that's what really made it striking. I mean, not that it happens every day, but we see people kind of breaking the logo, if you will, every now and then now. Back then, I mean, that was just like, oh my God, look at this. This is, it was incredible. And as I said then, I think there was a 2 to 3 year period where Carmine Infantino's cover designs were just off the wall, fantastic, just great. And doing covers where, you couldn't help but pick up the comic and buy it. You just had to, because you had to find out what happened inside. And the sad thing now is I'll go into a store and I see a rack of lots of comics and a lot of variant covers. And it's like, they don't necessarily do that. We do poster covers now more and more rather than editorially driven story content covers. Kind of a lost art.
Yeah, no, it is. We lament that all the time. That you've gone to that movie poster kind of approach to just trying to catch your eye, and it doesn't have anything to do with the story, or it's the characters all running at you, or they're all looking stoic or whatnot, and it doesn't have the that same enjoyment that we got out of
and they're really, in some cases, remarkably beautiful. And some of the painted covers and stuff like that now are just shockingly beautiful. But yeah, that sense of editorial concept, story content driven covers, we've kind of lost out on that.
I completely agree. Matt's asked this question a second time, so I wouldn't forget it, and I appreciate that, Matt. He said, what was Dan's favorite one and done story on Superman? Matt always enjoyed Superman 59, the Metropolis mailbag issues, and the drunk driving issue. You did so many good ones.
Thank you. Thank you, Matt. I think that if I were to pick one, and that's always hard to do, but it might be, there was a issue of Adventures of Superman I did that dealt with the concept of drunk driving. And I can't remember the exact issue number. But we dealt with that from the concept of, teens in cars, drinking and driving, and the perils that went along with that. Wonderfully inked by Art T. Bear. And that one sticks out because I think that would have been one of the first ones that I did that was a one and done, sort of a message issue, if you will. And then once I did that, said, boy, you can tell some great Superman stories this way. So I started to try to do them more often and fit it in with what we were also doing more often, which was the big mega crossovers across all the titles. So that whenever we were sitting in the room, I'd say, well, just leave that spot open. Well, I'm pointing off screen here. Well, I'll say, leave that spot open between issues, 104 and 107 of Superman, because I want to get one single kind of open and done story in there, if I could, please.
Well, that's cool. Thank you, Matt, for asking that and reminding me, because I did miss it earlier. Let's see here. Lord of Fleck wanted to know if you have any interest in doing Barbarian stuff. I don't know if from a writing or illustrating perspective. It says maybe Savage Sword when it relaunches next year.
Yeah, Actually, that sort of intrigues me, and some of it is because when I first started, as I said, my first monthly book was Warlord,
Hmm.
which was not barbarian, but certainly close to it, with swords, dinosaurs, and everything like that. And so, to a certain extent, to revisit that genre would allow me to make up for some of the mistakes I made the first time around, uh, which was I remember, I was probably about 4 issues into Warlord, and I said to Grell one point, "Hey, can we cut back on the horses a little bit, please?" It's, it's like, my God, I've got guys riding horses all through this story, every single issue, and horses take a long time. They really do. Yeah. So,
All right. Well, so then we know that, yeah, you don't want to have if you do a barbarian Conan story, that the fewer horses, the better.
yeah, exactly.
Let's see. Matt also mentioned something. Let's see. What did he say? Also, can't wait for the 30th anniversary Return of Superman book. I'm sure a lot of people are looking forward to that.
Yeah.
And where was the other question I saw here? Well, Sergio just recently asked, will you be involved in the TV show of Booster Gold? And have you ever done anything in, I guess, television or film? I guess, what level of involvement have you been in?
The closest thing we got, and this was fun, back when they first came out with the Lois and Clark TV series many years ago. We were able to go out and sit with the production team and just talk about the characters and talk about what their show might be relative to how the comics were. Because obviously live action TV is going to focus on some different things. And, I remember, we got to meet Terry Hatcher and Dean Cain and everybody else who was just really very early in their shooting schedule at that point. And that was fun. So it's nice to be asked. I think right now, as I understand it, because of the strike, everything regarding Booster has been and continues to be on hold. So we'll see.
Oh, that's too bad. But so no involvement on your side?
No, not yet. No.
Well, it would be unfortunate if you have to get credited as the creator of the character. I would have to assume we'll see your name in the credits when
yeah, one would hope. I think I just leave it at this, and I think that if I were ever going to adapt, say, a novel, or especially one that was written as a series of novels featuring a particular character, and that writer was still around, I'd talk to him.
Yeah.
I figured he might know something about what's happening. So yes.
Right. That's interesting. And I remember somebody. Well, where was it? The drug. Where was it? Speaking of, let's see. Collector Dome mentioned about the time you worked with Grell on Warlord. I know that that had to have been an interesting time because early on, I mean, Sword and Sorcery, Conan books were kind of the they were more popular than Spider-Man and Superman for a while there.
Yeah.
I think that lent to the popularity of Warlord, because there was a little period where you didn't really get a lot of that. And then I thought Grell and those storylines were just fantastic. I mean, I assume when you got that first job, you're probably pretty, I'm hoping you're pretty excited that, that was your place to start.
Oh, 100%. And in fact, there was a point, I hadn't been on it very long, where I was up in the office one day, and Kurt Swan came up to me, and I was just chatting with Kurt, and he said something like, "So you're working on that Warlord book, aren't you?" I said, "Yeah." And he said, "I hear that book makes a royalty." I said, yeah. And he said, "How much is it selling?" and I told him, and he just gave me one of these looks like, he shook his head because it was outselling Superman, and he kind of turned and walked down the aisle. So, but back then it did do well, and Sword and Sorcery was a thing that did well, and also Mike's stuff did well in general. It was the same thing when we were doing Green Arrow together a few years later, the Longbow Hunter stuff. That was doing extremely well too. And it was, And I think it's because, not that we used terminology like this then, but Mike had a brand and readers knew what they were going to get in a Mike Grell book. And there were a lot of readers who were into what they were going to get in a Mike Grell book. So yeah, they did well.
Yeah, that's interesting. So Matt's asking if you will we ever see any creator owned work from you?
Yeah, it's still on my my list of things to get to. It's it's odd. Because to a certain extent, for me, in a way, that's what Booster Gold had always kind of been.
Mm-hmm.
Do I own it? No. Do I look at it as something that was created solely and purely on its own without any help from anyone at DC and just did it? Yes. And do I still have stories, Booster Gold type stories to tell? Also a yes. So in a way that kind of fits into that fuzzy gray area. But yeah, there are ideas I have and things that I still want to do that would fit that creator owned, sphere of things. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. So, back to that royalty question. So was that, I mean, obviously that was kind of not the norm. Kurt Swan, who toiled away with in a wonderful manner. I mean, there's not a bad Kurt Swan page I've ever seen. I own a few myself because you can't help but admire the amount of work that he put into to Superman as a character. I mean, he was just brilliant. I mean, he drew one of my. I mean, his version of Superman. I mean, is just one that's ingrained in me. I think when I think of Superman, I think of Swan as one of the first two artists. Just the way they handled the character. I mean, he had drawn it so long in so many different titles and whatnot. It's unfortunate that royalties weren't a part of comics at that time. But so Grell's work on Warlord was a bit of an outlier in that way.
Well, yeah, royalties. No. To be clear.
Okay.
Yeah. Royalties were being paid at that time. It's just that Warlord was actually selling better than Superman.
Got it.
That's what it was. So yes, and Kurt was certainly getting some royalties. I think he just, if I were to put myself in his shoes, in retrospect, he was probably a little shocked that, punk ass 22-year-old kid standing here is making more in royalties on a book like Warlord than he is on Superman at that time.
Got it.
That's probably what it was. So, those were times when it was always very interesting to walk in the office because you'd get to see guys like that delivering pages. And I remember, meeting Gene Colan, for example, the first time, and Gene is there in his cardigan sweater and a necktie delivering his pages. And, the rest of us didn't look like that. And it's like, hello, Mr. Colan. It's so nice to meet you, that kind of thing. And it was great to be able to meet them and to see their work. And that's when Gene was doing the Batman stuff at DC and Night Force. So,
I really loved his Night Force too.
Oh, wasn't that great? Yeah,
absolutely. I was always a big horror comic fan, even when I was reading. I loved Thor, I loved X-Men and everything. But give me a good horror story. I thought Night Force was great. And,
it was,
and Gene was just perfect in it. I mean, he's one of those artists that he's kind of an acquired taste, right? I mean, probably even for the people who had an income, he was a challenging kind of visionary. But when he was right for a book, whether it was like a Doctor Strange, or even Daredevil, a few other things. I mean, he was just it was a wonder to see his work because he challenged you as a reader, as from a visual standpoint to really to get what he the mood or the action scenes, the way he was trying to convey it. But and I don't know if I really appreciated him as much when I was reading them, in the 80s. But I look at it now, and he's one of the most dynamic illustrators of the last 40-50 years. I mean, because his approach to anatomy and I mean, you name it. I don't know. He's just one of those unsung guys that I did get the opportunity to talk to several times at shows, but I regret the fact that it was not anything that we got a chance to record. So it'd be out there for everybody to enjoy today.
Yeah. And if you go back to kind of the stuff we were talking about in the beginning, where you think of, I talked about artists being unable to put their stamp on a book and build that identifier.
Mhm.
And we all know what Gene did with Doctor Strange, of course. But if you think of his work on Dracula, of Tomb of Dracula,
Sure. I
which
didn't
was
even
just
say that.
what a great run, and to the point where I can't possibly conceive of anyone else having drawn that series over that amount of time,
Mhm.
because he made it so much his own, not just the book itself, but everything that was in it in terms of the secondary characters, the cast, the settings, the mood, just everything about it, just brilliant stuff, and so underrated to this day.
No, I agree. And it's it even shows, because we can look at, as art collectors, we can sort of look at creators' work over time, and and certainly even his Dracula work doesn't measure up sales wise to to his Doctor Strange work, or
Yeah,
and a lot of that it is just, it's the story and it's the way you remember the comics, because a lot of times I think price in the art market is really swayed one way or another based on how much you remember the story and how important it was to you. I mean, for art buyers, it is a major factor, in whether or not you're going to overpay for a piece of art, versus not. And yeah, I've never done research specifically on his, Doctor Strange versus Daredevil versus Dracula versus Howard the Duck, right? But I think if I did, I'm pretty confident there would be a rather large gap, between like Howard and Dracula to
yeah,
Doctor Strange, and that's unfortunate, because it is art. At the end of the day, it's always art, but it's interesting how story, really does drive, a market even in the aftermarket for art sales.
true, very true.
So what did obviously there was a lot of Death of Superman artwork on the market in the last few years. I mean, what have you uh, what did you think of that? I mean, when you look at work of your own, either that you were as a writer or putting pencil to paper, and then seeing people love and value the work so much that they're willing to pay five figures for an interior panel page, right?
Mhm.
That was, I'm sure might not have meant the same to you while you were doing it, but a piece of art doesn't sell for something, like $38,000 or whatever, one of the interior pages that you worked on sold for. But it shows you how much people care about the story and the characters enough to want to spend that much money. But I mean, but yeah, it was so back to the question. I mean, it was, because it was very interesting to see a lot of those Death of Superman pages come out after being kept by the creator for so long.
Yeah, and of course you're speaking of
Mhm.
John Bogdanov stuff, and yeah, it was. And I say, John, congratulations. I'm very happy for you, and it's great that you kept it that amount of time. You know, because in a way, you as an artist, as a creator, you pour your heart and soul into it. And I know
Mhm.
that with Superman 75, Brett Breeding and I got together and we sold it at an auction back then. And that's when, some of the high end stuff was going that way. Like Jim Lee sold X-Men 1. I think Rob sold New Mutants, or one of the books anyway. And that's kind of what was done then.
Mhm.
Fortunately, I've still held on to enough of it that I've got some. None of us ever foresaw days like this coming. And I think you ask any artist into a person, they'd all say, yeah, I should have held on to more.
Right.
So there's that as well. But at the same time, it is fun to see the appreciation for it, and to see that this stuff that even when I started, the concept of uh, taking a comic, it would come out. There was no thought that would it ever be reprinted.
Mhm.
I mean, even for me, it's trade paperbacks didn't really exist yet. So this idea that we would end up with multiple hardcovers and soft covers and everything else, and that these stories would live on for people, and that interest would still be there, whether it's 20, 30, 40 years later, whatever. It's remarkable, and it's been fun to be involved in it.
Well, that's good to hear. I mean, I'd like to think, because I've always felt that the art has always been sort of underappreciated, right? When a graded comic, can sell for, 5 figures, but the original art from that same comic, has a hard time reaching $1,000 for an interior page. It's always a head scratcher, right? Because,
Yeah.
there could be 10,000, graded comics at a 9.6 or better that could sell for such a high rate, but then the artwork that is really one of a kind, wasn't able to reach that. I think that's one of the, well, it's one of the more disappointing sides of the fact, that you can't afford all the things you want. It's nice to see that it's really being viewed as an art form that has value, and it's not just something that's a byproduct of the comic, and the comic's the more valuable thing. I mean, I think I'd like to think we're going to look back on comic creators and artists, and this goes back to even the thought, the European model and view of creators, that these things truly are works of art, and the creators who have put the effort to work in this genre of storytelling are incredibly important, and will have really been impactful, in the 20th century and the 21st century. So I'd like to think that this is kind of the beginning of that, where people are finally realizing that they're not just pieces of nostalgia that we really when you see a page and you just like, I want to own it because I remember reading it. It's really because it's an incredible work of art, and it deserves that place. It needs to be in a museum. We joke about it a lot, like that art should be in a museum, but it really should. And I think that that's kind of part of what what my goal of trying to do that in-person show is. I think we need to find ways to let people know that this is a really important art medium, and it's not just the sales of the artwork that should be indicative of that. It should be a different, higher level of appreciation for the art and the creators that have put their time in.
I obviously it wouldn't be shocking, or it would be shocking if I didn't agree, and I do, but and I think and I wonder if now that we have more and more guys working digitally, if it will change even more, because I still look back on it, and if I had my way, everything I drew would still go to a letterer for hand lettering on the board to be done the way it should be, because that's what a comic really is, right? And I just am very firm on that one, but it's almost impossible to pull off anymore. But that's what I look back on is that sense of that incredible amount of work that you see that can go into one page, and it's still astounding to me. It is. Comics are so very much labor intensive to actually write and draw a comic. And I don't mean from the perspective of one person writing and just drawing, that's it. If you look at the amount of human hours that goes into a single 22-page comic, and I say that in terms of the writer, the artist, if there's a separate anchor, the colorist, the letterer, the editorial team, and everything, there is just an absolutely stunning amount of hours that goes into making one single comic book. It's just mind blowing. So it's nice that we've gotten over that thought that existed many, many years ago, that it was still just a disposable medium, and it is not that now. Mm-hmm. But yeah, so hopefully we'll get to that point, because the quality of drawing and artwork that exists in some books is absolutely, it's just astounding. You just look at it and it's just incredible.
Oh, I agree. I mean, I think we see a lot of modern, younger illustrators that have come in the last, 5-10 years. And a lot of them it's nice to see that, the ones that still are traditional are really, some of them are kind of pushing the boundaries on things. I think that's fun. I mean, because you could take, the technology gives everybody a shortcut these days, right? Where maybe you don't have to shade everything the way you'd want to, and or you have to because the colorists can do that, or or they can digitally ink it and do it all a lot faster. But I admire the artists that still, there's still some artists out there that like to put their gray tones in as washes, and it's great to see, because I think a lot of us have that fear that eventually, 20, 30 years from now, there might not be a tangible piece of art for, that maybe the covers will still be done, that way, but maybe a lot of the interiors are not going to be done traditionally any longer. And that's unfortunate. It really, it would, it's like the but I don't know. I don't like to think about it. You know, as an art collector, I'd like to think that there will always be artists that want to kind of push the edge traditionally, and you know, but I guess time's going to tell. You know, I've got 3 kids, and they're all more adept at drawing on their iPads or, you know, a Wacom tablet on their PC in Photoshop than they are, you know, trying to do a finished piece on a piece of paper. They still use sketchbooks, right? I mean, to kind of maybe fiddle around with ideas, but when they want to do a finished piece, it's always digital.
Oh yeah, yeah. I understand. I don't like it, but I understand it.
Well, we're in the same boat there.
Yeah.
Let's see. Carl mentioned that once I realized you could actually commission art, Dan was at my first convention
Oh,
staff.
really? Okay.
Fantastic.
How about that? Okay. Thank you.
Let's see. I know I saw a couple of you know, it's an interesting question from Thomas. Out of the, you know, the newer artists that are out there, are there any that stand out to you in any particular way, whether it's from their storytelling ability through their art, or you just really, you know, dig their work like you do with Orion Sook, who's been around a while, of course. But...
Yeah, yeah. Ryan has now, although I still consider him relatively new.
I won't tell him you said that.
Okay, now I'm on the spot. I like a lot of the stuff I've seen from Ryan Stegman.
Yes.
Some of the Spider-Man stuff there, but I don't know. He's probably been around long enough now that we can't call him new anymore. Yeah, I'd have to. Dan Mora is someone who I see. His stuff is very energetic, and I like that. So, yeah, there are certainly people out there who are doing some nice, fun stuff.
Dan Muller says, "Loved your work on Solar Man of the Atom Run."
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that was a fun little period. Trying something different there. That was also a good time. It was just one of those things where all the Valiant stuff, which it had so much energy to it, was going through so much in the way of changes as we were trying to pull off what they called the Birthquake stunt, where we were shipping books twice a month and everything. So yeah, interesting days.
Well, I mean, it's hard to imagine doing something like that, you know, today. But yeah, everything was very different there, right? I mean, I think the energy was great. I mean, they had a strong mission, and we're putting out a lot of great books.
Yep,
it was kind of infectious, even, you know. And I typically always stuck with Marvel, but I even picked up some Valiant titles just because I was curious. There, you know, how could this upstart kind of a company come out and do things that I think it made the big two, you know, really take notice that they could do great things.
Well, so that whole era of comics. So if we're talking, you know, early 90s, early into mid 90s, maybe even a little bit to late 80s. I just call that whole era, like there was that 8-year era, say, I call it the Wizard Age of comics. And because of Wizard magazine, and I think you needed so many elements to kind of fall in together, whether it was the X stuff, whether it was then what became Image, whether it was Valiant, whether it was Death of, so many things that kind of fueled around the energy that was there in the industry at that time was so incredible. And to me, it was all kind of symbolized by Wizard magazine. So I just call it the Wizard Age of comics. But the thing I remember so much about that time is you could walk into any comic book store, like on a Saturday afternoon at 2:00, and it was filled like with 13, 14, 15-year-old kids buying comics. And that's where I talk about the energy and the amount of readers that we had then, that were more, you know, general customer type readers rather than the hardcore, you know, 52-year-old guys who still go to the comic store every Wednesday for their pull list or whatever. There was just energy and enthusiasm and young readers involved in the business, in terms of consumers, that just drove so much of it. It was a great time.
Yeah, I mean, I was when can I first drive? 84. And I love the fact that I could go to the comic book shop and pick up, I was big on the on Grendel and Elementals, and when those things were coming out. I even liked Ms. Mystic when Neil Adams did that too. I mean, it was just
okay,
it was a fun period. But the thing is, just like what you're saying though, that you'd go into the shop and there would be a lot of a diverse group of people who were still out there and buying it. It was a fun period of time. That is for sure. Yeah, I miss that. I definitely miss that because I read most of my stuff digitally now. Whenever I do get out to a shop these days, it's definitely not the same. Unfortunately, the business has changed a lot.
That it has.
Yeah, Nick Ferrucci says Miss Mystic was beautiful. It was as a book. Yeah, I mean, it was that was a fun time. Because you had Miller's Dark Knight coming out, and it was the format just blew you away. Everybody was experimenting with lots of different ththings during that era. Made the whole it made you want to go to the comic shop to see what you might actually see from week to week. Not knowing.
100%, and it was fueled, and the beauty of it was fueled by so many different sources. Here's little Valiant that started out as a small thing, and Shooter and Layton and everybody they had working there. I mean, they just built it into an incredible label because they were doing really, really good books, and they created this unique universe as they did it. I mean, it was really an astounding achievement. It was just really good books and really good writing that got everybody on board. And that was fantastic. And so there was just that sense of energy that was palpable. And one thing would always seem to lead to the next, right? And it was like, you won't believe what happened this month because wait till you see next month, it's going to be even bigger. And I don't mean that in terms of any particular character or any particular publisher. It's just, that's the sense we had, is there was this, I think, sense of energy and momentum.
True. Let's see, Brian Bailey mentions that 10 years ago, I was told by my comic shop guy that DC told him they weren't making comics for kids anymore. They were making them for 30-year-old men. I don't know. Do you feel that way when you're putting together a book, Dan?
That's not how I work.
Well, that's good.
That's straight up. That is, I've had conversations like that, and that is not how I approach the work. Others do. I do not.
Good.
Yeah.
Good. I mean, so many of us learned how to read from comic books, right? I mean, if without the kids, I mean, there's no future for comics. So you really have to approach it, at least to some degree, that you still want to encourage young readers to take interest in it. I think that maybe in a weird way, I mean, Scholastic has been very, I think, instrumental in keeping comics in at least in young kids' minds. I think they've done a fantastic job. I've been thinking about, I need to do an interview with somebody at Scholastic just to kind of get their perspective on the business and their approach, because I think it's a very important thing that they continue to do that does keep comics at least in kids' minds, because otherwise I do think that a lot of just the way comics are distributed now, that children just wouldn't get into books, into comic books anymore, if it wasn't for Scholastic.
I agree. And I would also say, and I stress this too, I don't think it's an either or proposition that comics have to be for 12-year-old kids, 15-year-old kids, or 30-year-old men. It's not an either or. I think good, well-written, well-drawn stuff can appeal to both and across that spectrum. I absolutely believe that.
I'm sorry, I'm just reading a couple questions here. Back, Dan, I loved your Superman Rebirth run. Did you ever have any more plans that you weren't able to get to in those? And I would assume that has to happen a lot, right? It's not like you can stay on a title for as long as you'd like to tell all the stories you'd like. I mean, are there stories? I mean, we could use Superman Rebirth as one example where there's more that you wish you had the opportunity to tell, and hopefully maybe at some point in the future you'll get that opportunity.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, so if we go back to Action 1000, Pete Tomasi, who was writing the other Superman title at that time, we had actually written a draft for Action 1000 that was substantially different than what appeared. and then we were going to take off with our storylines from there. Obviously, DC ended up making some big change along the way, so those stories were never realized. And I think, yeah, to this day, really proud of what we did during the Rebirth stuff. That I think, first of all, I think it was just plain a good format. That to be able to, if you're writing a character and your book comes out twice a month, you can tell the story a little bit differently. You can spend a little more time on, if it's Lois and Clark and they have a son, for example, on some of those things, and then spread the action stuff out a little more. So in other words, you can round out the characters better because your audience, your readership isn't as likely to forget what happened the issue before. So it was a gratifying way to work. And I think I know we did. I just talked to Pete the other day. We had other stories we wanted to tell. We just didn't get the chance to do it. So it was fun. It was a somewhat experimental way to work just because everybody was, all the DC books at that time were basically shipping twice a month. There was a lot to keep up with. But there again, I thought the line had a sense of energy to it and a sense of momentum. And like the characters seemed to matter. And I don't just mean ours. I mean kind of across the board of what was happening in the books. And it was a good time.
Let's see. Sergio wanted to know how well did Blue and Gold do in sales, to know if there would be a new saga of them.
We have talked about a couple of possibilities along those lines and whether or not we want to do it. And I think this gets back to the uncertainty of what's happening in other markets. And by markets, I mean media markets. If the Booster Gold TV series goes forward and becomes a reality, yes, then something like that is much more likely. Because obviously that's the kind of thing publishers are paying a lot more attention to now. And it's always been like that to a certain degree. So we'll see.
Interesting. So any plans to go back to Marvel and tackle Spider-Man or anything like that in the future?
I actually have a Marvel cover over on my desk that I'm drawing right now. I've been doing a bunch of covers there the past couple of years. When I can fit it in, I'd like to. I'm just kind of coming to the point where I'm finishing up a bunch of DC stuff over the next 6 weeks that will finally be done and open. I'm intentionally opening up my schedule so I can look at doing a few different things like that. So we'll see.
All right. That's promising. Let's see. I want to make sure I didn't miss any other questions. I think I got them all here in the chat. Nick Ferrucci wanted everybody to know that he bought the original art of Superman 64 with the Metropolis mailbag. It's one of his favorite Jurgens Superman books. Nice. Very nice.
Yeah, I've obviously known Nick a long time then. So yeah. Yeah. But Nick was always into the stuff big time. He really was. Well, I love Nick's energy for the business and art in general. I really do. Nick and I have a lot of fun talking about art.
Here's Peter Rowe just mentioned early on. I think he said he enjoyed your work with inker Norm Mund. I think there's a fair number of pieces of yours on the site that Norm's inked as well. I was kind of going through CAF earlier today because Norm has a gallery on the site too. I think he's got some pieces that he's kept that he's inked of yours.
Yeah, we just wrapped up. I did a 10-page sequence in Superman 7, which is also Superman 850, kind of that double numbered thing.
Right.
And Norm inked that. We just wrapped that up like over the weekend. So yeah, that's done. That'll be coming out soon, I believe.
All right, cool. Well, that's cool. And then we have this is just a comment. Alberto, who is a huge Captain America fan, said that I was a huge fan of your Captain America run, and I'm so glad to have a couple of your Captain America covers too. So
thank you. Yeah, that was because that's the other thing I was doing at Marvel while I was writing Thor. I was writing and drawing Cap. So that was a fun time. But out of all the characters I've ever worked on, to me, Captain America was about the hardest.
From the illustration or writing side?
Writing.
Writing.
The symbology of Cap is so prevalent in the visualization of the character
Mm-hmm.
that sometimes you kind of want to get around that a little bit, and different people have succeeded in that. And if you think of like the Nomad storyline that was done so long ago, where they kind of get away from that a little bit, it's almost like as soon as you're working on a Cap, that becomes a temptation. So it can be difficult to do.
Well, Alberto he's very appreciative of your run.
Thank you, Alberto.
Let's see here. Let's see. Dan, Collector Don't mention he loved your Ben Reilly covers.
Oh, thanks.
Yep.
That was a lot of fun to go back to. This is for the Ben Reilly miniseries that they did last year, and to go back and draw that character again and do the covers. And that's where, they had asked me about doing the covers, and somehow just in the conversation where I had mentioned that I had the Ben Reilly costume design that I had done at that time, because it was similar to like we did with Doomsday, where Mark Bagley ended up designing the costume that we voted to actually use. So, and then Marvel took the version I did and did a variant cover out of it. So it got published after, almost 30 years. That was nice to see.
Did they call you up and let you know that you were finally using that art that you did all those years ago?
Well, actually, they didn't even know that such a thing existed, and I explained to them. So when we were when I went over to Marvel to do Sensational Spider-Man, we were going to do a new costume and everything, and Mark Bagley did his version of what it would look like. I did a version. I think there was a third one. I don't remember who did that. But we all said, we like Bagley's version. Let's go with that one. So I still had the design sitting in my flat files. And so I let them know, we had a kind of a contest to see whose was going to get picked. And we all liked Mark's and went with that one. I mentioned that I still had mine, and they said, well, okay, we're going to print that. So great. Like I said, almost 30 years later, if you want to print something that's been unprinted, let's do it.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
Let's see here. A couple other questions here before we end the night. Sergio wanted to know, what was it like working on 0 Hour, given that it was the second major DC Comics reboot in continuity? Was there a weight of the first Crisis present while you were, and probably the success of the first Crisis present when you were working on 0 Hour?
It was probably the single most intensive project I have ever done in comics, because I was writing and drawing 0 Hour while also working with all the other editorial teams as they worked to cross over with it and have their own Zero issues. It was incredibly intensive, and it was very pre-computer. So in my studio, I had on the floor the entire output of what was connected to 0 Hour in terms of the other DC books lined up alphabetically. So in paper form, because you couldn't pull it up on the computer then. So it was all in paper form. So every book had a stack of Xerox pencils with inks, lettered pages, scripts, everything like that. And just that I had to wade through. Plus, I was writing and drawing it as a crossover, and it was going to come out weekly. So, these days, like someone does a crossover and they have a different artist every other issue, and it's coming out like monthly. And I'm going, what the fuck? But somehow I wrote and drew 5 issues of it, and it came out weekly.
Unbelievable.
So, it was when it was finally done, DC very nicely sent me a bottle of champagne, said, kick back and enjoy yourself. And that's a good thing, because it almost put me in an early grave. It was, doing a crossover is hard anyway. And when you're doing it as both writer and artist, it was incredibly intensive and crazy long days. There was a period in my career where I worked crazy hours, and that I don't necessarily recommend for anyone. But again, it was the energy that was there.
Yeah, how would you work with an editor in that way when because you had to, but you're being that busy, it almost seems like you wouldn't have time to just take a break and send them some pages or parts of the script. I mean, they'd almost, if they were, unless they were living with you, where they could
No,
just walk in
and
periodically.
the editor on the book was Casey Carlson,
Mhm.
and fortunately, so this is back when DC had kind of the three-headed managing editorial crew of Mike Carlin, Denny O'Neil, and Archie Goodwin, who were great. They let us do what we had to do. They made sure that people were very cooperative with us, and at the same time, Casey Carlson was pretty much just devoted to this project, which is what you have to do to pull it off. And really, I think the success of it was to have a month of 0 issues where, as I told all the writers at that time, look, this is your chance where you're going to get someone to sample your book, a lot of someones that you wouldn't normally have. And what you can do is in that issue, show them who your main characters are, show them show readers what motivates them, why they do what they do, and set up some dazzling story possibilities to keep them coming back. And it was fun. That sense of energy really drove it. And yes, we did our best to try and live up to what Crisis on Infinite Earths established, because that is, to me, still the premier crossover in comics. But I don't know if we got there or not. That's up for others to decide. But we gave it our good shot.
That's you were very encouraging to give people the just, hey, do your best, focus on your strengths, and just know that good. It just sounds like that as a creative process, getting to work with the writers and the artists through that it had to have been pretty dang exciting. And did any, I mean, not to pick anybody out, I mean, but did any of the co-creators that you were working with at that time kind of like show you a different level that they could reach that you weren't really expecting from them, or did pretty much everybody deliver what the quality that you knew they could produce?
I in all honesty, the one that I think really proved out and only surprised me from this standpoint, when on the phone people started explaining Starman to me, I thought, oh, that sounds good. But then when I saw it realized as the artwork and everything started to come in, it was like, wow, this is some cool shit. And I think that's really when, as a creator, when you see someone else doing great stuff, you yourself kind of get jazzed. It's like, oh, James Robinson. Okay. I see what you're doing here. I better, spend a little more time working tonight, and you're raising the bar. And so, and that was fun to see come through. That I think we all knew that as soon as the stuff started coming in on some of those new books, that Starman was going to run away with it.
Oh, that's cool. I mean, that you get to take that opportunity to, to see it and recognize it. And it gives you a little push yourself too, right? Because if somebody else is raising their game, it should inspire everybody else to equally do the same.
Yes.
One last question and we'll call it a night. And Rob T says, does Dan have a favorite booster page from the original run? And then asks, do you still own it? But do you think about your stories and your work in that way, where can you actually single out a single page, whether it's the art itself or what was conveyed in the story, that you could say you actually have a favorite page or moment from any run, let alone from Booster Gold?
The answer to that is yes. And typically it's weird because people might think, oh, it's going to be this cover or that splash page or something like that. And it's often not that. It's you challenge yourself somehow to come up with something different, or you experimented with something that came across a little differently. In terms of Booster Gold, I still have the entire first issue, for example, put away in the files, and I don't keep that because it's brilliant stuff. I keep it because I look back on it, and yes, it's a first issue, but it's also to get to that point where, pretty quickly after I had started to be writing and drawing a monthly comic of my own that way at DC, it meant a lot to me because, at that time, DC had a very open door policy. They made it clear they were looking for new creative type different things.
Hmm.
And I think you saw a lot of that coming from DC, within the next few years and everything. So there are things like that that I still have, and pages I have. In some cases, it's because I drew a friend in the background of a panel, or something like that. It's a lot of different reasons, or because I just plain really like the way it came out. And in some cases, yes, it's covers, and sometimes it's just page 13 for whatever reason. I like a panel on the page and held on to it. Yes.
Hmm. Cool.
Yeah. Or it's who else you worked with on it. So I had done Captain America cover that was inked by John Romita Sr. So of course I'm going to keep that, things like that. Yes.
Right, right. Well, and those are moments that you just never, we can't duplicate them. You never know if you're going to get to have John, ink your work. That's just that's cool. I mean, I love the fact that when creators really enjoy their work as much as we do, to the point where they hold on to it for those same reasons. I mean, whether it's a collaboration or like you said, Booster Gold #1. It's not, it's sentimental, and it should be. I mean, I think that's wonderful. It's one of, like we said earlier, it's like a lot of creators let go of a lot of things that they probably would rather have kept, and I think we're seeing a little bit more of that these days from savvy artists, keeping some things back and holding on to things that are special to them, and that's great. I mean, it means that you care as much as we do about the work that you're doing.
Yes. And it's funny. I've always been mystified by the guys who sell absolutely everything. And it's like, as soon as the book is done, they're out there selling it. And it's like, you can at least hold on to it for 6 months. And they'll say, well, then the market won't be as hot. And I'll say, yeah, but you'll still have it.
Exactly.
I have never regretted not selling something. I've only regretted selling something. And that's, I've never ever regretted holding on to a piece of art or buying a piece of art. So
yeah, that's so you had. So would you call yourself a collector, or you just picked up a few things up? Oh, good.
Yeah, here and there.
I guess maybe I could have started the interview with that, but maybe that'll be something we talk about another time. I mean, I had no idea. That's wonderful.
Definitely. Dan. Yes.
Because it is funny. A lot of probably the reason I don't even think to ask is I've talked to a lot of creators over the last 3 years, and by and large, when I do ask that question, most people say no. Or I've traded a piece here or there, with another creator who we both admired our work. So sure. But it never seemed like it was, that they have the same genuine, love for the medium, at least to own the artwork as we as collectors do. So I've kind of avoided that question. So that I think that's great.
No, absolutely. I do. Yes.
Well, all right. Well, that's good to know. Well, that's a good point where we can end everything tonight. But
okay.
Dan, this has been wonderful. I really have enjoyed talking with you. I'm looking forward to getting to hang out with you when we get to OAX in January. But yeah, this has been great. We definitely should do it again. I'd like to. Clearly, the audience has enjoyed this a lot. They get to fuel half the questions, so that's always a lot of fun to have engaged viewers. So thank you for doing this, and thank you for everybody for hanging out with us for the last couple hours.
Yes, thank you.
We sincerely appreciate it. So have a wonderful night, and we'll see you again on the channel tomorrow night. I've got Jim Amash on tomorrow. We're going to talk about some studio time that he's had with some different creators too. So we'll probably get into some stories from, because I'll tell you, Dan, the best, it's when I talk with the creators, some of the best stories we get are the work that you've done with other people, and just getting stories and hearing about interesting opportunities that they've had over the years to work with people who maybe aren't with us anymore. So again, thank you for doing this, and we'll see